It's wonderful to see so many people here, particularly given that this is a post-liberal conference. The post-prandial conversations last night went on, as they should have done, late into the evening. I'm very pleased to be acting as moderator for this session. We're going to have a talk from Professor John Milbank. Everyone here will know John. If post-liberalism has such a thing as a pope, then he is His Holiness. And then afterwards, we will have responses to John's talk, and then, of course, questions and comments from the audience. But I shall hand over to John now. John.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Michael, for those kind words. And of course, we're thrilled that Michael can be here with us. And I want to thank the entire audience for their tremendous participation yesterday. And please just keep it up today. A lot of you have been handed the manifesto of the Centre for Social Renewal. So the first part of that was published online this week in the New Statesman, and we've now issued the whole thing, and it'll eventually appear in our online blog. So that's your party bag to take home with you. So the politics of virtue. Liberalism was invented in the 17th century West in the course of what historians have long since come to call a general crisis. Today, we seem to be facing another and more global general crisis as we enter a new era that can reasonably be considered post-liberal, since popular forces are effectively rejecting the upshots of both extreme economic liberalism and extreme cultural liberalism. In fact, the first general crisis was already global, to the extent that in Russia and the Far East, there were also significant new socio-political tensions. Everywhere, there were damaging climatic impacts of the Little Ice Age. In Russia, as in the West, there was a crisis of religious identity to do with the protests of the Old Believers. In the Far East, as in the West, to a degree, something like a more alienated state governmental formation was overriding inherited feudal structures. But only in the West was the crisis consummate and epochal. In contrast to Russia, the shared religious settlement of Christendom broke down altogether. It was no longer possible, in consequence, to base the international order, or even often the internal national order, upon a shared social consensus, a common vision as to the nature of reality. As a result, the switch to state formations was, in the Latin West, both more conscious and more extreme. Where in the East, something like a feudalo-absolutism of an ultimately state-directed economy and social order took hold, in the West, the new monopolization of coercive power by a state standing over against society went hand in hand with a new individualism and a tendency to abolish all mediating structures between these two poles. We see this most clearly reflected in thinkers like Grotius, Hobbes, and Pufendorf. They invented something novel in the course of universal history. If it is no longer possible to base political legitimacy upon a social consensus as to truth, then we have to take the counterintuitive course of distilling order from inherent disorder, or from the self-interest and the natural fears of what are taken to be inherently isolated individuals. Order, in consequence, is no longer substantive, based upon a common agreement as to the nature of the truly good life, but formal, based upon an uneasy pact or contract to respect each other's rights over one's own person or property. This is no longer then a politics of the integral embodied soul. It's no longer a politics of soul shaping, but a politics of the control of a material order by the arbitrarily choosing will, whether of the individual or of the state. All this is in stark contrast to the nature of all global civilizational order ever since the era of mere tribes. From ancient Egypt onwards, order had been based upon some kind of soul shaping, whereby in a spiral process, the polity seeks to educate people into virtue, and this education into virtue seeks to ensure a virtuous exercise of rule. In the later so-called axial era of the Hebrew prophets, of Socrates and the Buddha, the vision of virtue came to be based upon something more seen as transcendent and universal. Precisely for this reason, the civilization, often comprising diverse nations, is much older than the state and still more the nation-state. It is only with the collapse in the West of civilizational unity in the wake of the Reformation that the state starts to assume political priority, and international relations come to be regarded as secondary to the internal political order of the state itself. Just as with the state, the only other significant legal unit is now the individual, so commensurably in the more anarchic international sphere, the only legal actor is the individual nation, such that international peace depends more henceforwards upon contingent treaty than upon shared cultural and jurisprudential horizon. In two other regards also, liberalism defined as foundational individualism is novel. First, it no longer sees the polity as a kind of community of communities, or a body of subordinate bodies whose relatively independent existence it assumes. Secondly, it breaks with the so-called tripartite order of socialist states, which, as none other than Thomas Piketty emphasizes, we now know to be more or less common to all civilizations and not just to Indo-European ones, as famously claimed by Georges Dumézil. According to this tripartition, there is a roughly priestly or knowledge class which guides the society, and then there's a ruling and military class which protects it, and finally there's a laboring class which supplies it with its wants and luxuries. As we see with the Indian caste system, often a fourth mercantile class was placed between the ruling and the laboring one. Despite the prodigious vision of Hobbes, which was in any case regarded as aberrant at the time, the full achievement of an unalloyed monopolization of sovereignty, along with the abolition of particularly privileged corporate bodies below the state level, and the abolition of the tripartite rule of estates in favor of a society based on property ownership, this really only arrives with the French Revolution. Now, the critics of that event, like Joseph de Maistre and Edmund Burke, basically suggested that just for this reason, the revolution was going against our social civilizational nature and attempting a kind of impossible anti-politics. I can't help saying here that unlike J.C.D. Clarke's nominalism, and remember that liberalism is a nominalist invention, these conservative thinkers were surely saying some historical changes are outright impossible. So, as we shall see, this claim that liberal politics tends to disembed the political state from a natural social order proved by no means exclusive to a reactionary right-wing politics, or to be only the insight of the right rather than of the left. It might be much better to think of it as the first post-liberal insight, the first post-liberal questioning of the historical inevitability or even possibility of a purely liberal order based on individualism and self-ownership. Yet surely one can interject at this point the liberal order that resulted from the 17th century general crisis has proved not only to be very perdurable, but also uniquely successful. Here one can agree that the emancipatory unleashing of both individual human freedom and the attempt to master nature in order to improve our material happiness has been real and has ensured a certain legitimacy for liberalism. Nonetheless, the post-liberal claim that the very success of liberalism has also proved its eventual undoing is plausible. If, in fact, the Hobbesian vision is based upon a lie, and there is no state of nature that is the war of all against all, but there are always already groups of belonging and guidance by various recognized shamans of one sort or another, then at the core of liberalism resides a tendency to render its founding fiction, after all, real, and as it were, to turn theoretical lies into lived lies in historical reality. For nothing guarantees that the fearful or self-seeking individual will not calculate that he can safely violate public order. And nothing guarantees that the guardians of that formal liberal order will not exercise an oligarchic tyranny in the name of keeping a supposedly disinterested formal peace. Thus, liberalism tends to produce the lie of the war against all, and it can't, in fact, guarantee that its liberal order will keep at bay that artificially produced war of all against all. These processes within states are all the more compounded within the inherently anarchic international sphere. In our own day, this self-deconstruction of liberalism seems to be occurring more and more in many different ways. But why should it be occurring only now if the post-liberal claim that the liberal order is inherently unnatural and unstable is really true? There are two answers to that question. First, up till relatively recently, there has been no purely liberal order. Instead, we have to say that only yesterday, like the 1950s when I was born, the Middle Ages had never really gone away. The bondings and rootedness supplied by religion, by ancestral and extended families, by the habits of place and the solidarities of manual and professional work, all these remain significantly in place. To this degree, liberalism has mostly remained an embedded liberalism, to such a degree that this 21st century's attempt to disembed it entirely are met with an immediate popular fury, as we saw a few weeks ago, and an appeal to what the populace regards, perhaps half deludedly, as their given and immemorial way of life. Secondly, and just as importantly, this is, after all, as already indicated, by no means the first post-liberal moment in history. Already, by the time of the French Revolution, enlightened thinkers, including Burke, were having second thoughts. Was the liberal commercial order corrupting the state through debt, war, empire, and slavery? Was it contaminating popular virtue and resilience with luxury, consumerism, and the demagogic appeals of direct democracy? Quite soon, these concerns were joined by other more drastic ones. At first, often on the Catholic right, although also the Anglican and Lutheran right, but soon on a now socialist left. Were the owners of capital overriding concrete wealth and production in an abstract capitalist fashion concerned only with the accumulation of profit and lending at interest? Did this capitalist interest, in fact, tend to exaggerate the division of labor beyond mere technological exigencies, in such a way as to damage the rounded integrity of the human individual and to constrain and enrich some sectors of production at the expense of others, especially to subordinate the agricultural production of necessities to the industrial production of luxuries and superfluities? And was not real concrete freedom only to be achieved through cooperation with others in local communities and working guilds? Still more profoundly, was the unleashing of modern negative freedom of choice, realized at the expense of ancient positive freedom of political participation, self-realization through the religious contemplation of the good, and the artistic production of the beautiful. The pursuit of this sort of liberty of full flourishing was taken to be inseparable from an ultimate ruling guidance by either the ecclesial priesthood or by a secular clerisy. In point of fact, it is striking that when a much more explicit and atheistic rationalism prevailed in the 19th century, beyond anything known to the 18th century Enlightenment, with the arrival of Auguste Comte and positivism, it actually deserts liberalism altogether for a kind of secular parody and reworking of the hierarchical tripartite order, with rational scientists now being the ultimate directors of governance. To a degree, indeed, this positivist vision was then melded with a liberal one, as in the case of later French republicanism and of John Stuart Mill in England. What one has here is a kind of tacit liberal concession that de Maistre was partially correct, that a liberal order is impossible, and that in reality, a putatively formal political order is really guided by a substantive claim to objective knowledge, which should therefore prevail. So in our own day, it is a further extension of this kind of positivist mutation of liberalism, as with the handling of the COVID pandemic, that is tending to invite popular suspicion and rejection. In the course of the 19th century, both on the right and on the left, one had more broadly two sorts of post-liberal attempts to qualify liberalism. First, the current that came eventually to be identified as social democracy, which typically assumes a kind of dual social ontology. There is, on the one hand, the relatively anarchic and amoral or merely utilitarian sphere of the market, and on the other hand, the more ethical and deliberative sphere of government, concerned with rights, mutual sympathy, and sometimes duty, in an extension of Adam Smith's contrast of the economic realm of expediency with the sympathetic and political realm of justice. In a somewhat contradictory fashion, there is supposed to be a moral taming of the untamable, or a kind of compromise between the ethical and the unethical, or else the incommensurate values of public utility and private right. Rather implausibly, Hegel tried to show how this could be regularly achieved by an intermediary, solemn administrative class, itself operating out of financial self-interest rather than the direct exercise of virtue, as Michael Sonnenscher in this university has so brilliantly explained. The other historic post-liberal current is more radical and especially exemplified by mutualist socialists like Proudhon, and also by the evolution of Catholic social teaching, which is basically socialism renamed so as not to confuse itself with atheism. Instead of merely deploying public capital to qualify private, or redistribution and education to qualify the alienating effects of the division of labour, it sought to distribute capital and ownership themselves more widely, and to reverse the machine-human relationship to favour the single individual or groups of individuals performing many tasks in smaller workshops, rather than allowing the interests of unregulated capital to spread ever further the division of labour. Compared with the mature Marx's attempt to abolish capital and property altogether, and to combine a pure individualism of use with a fully automated division of labour, this may seem to us at once more realistic, more radical, more humane, and more hopeful. Up till the early 1970s, both these 19th century post-liberal currents were not only still alive, but eventually dominant. Social democracy came to the fore in the American New Deal and the European post-war years. But fascism, other Latin authoritarian conservatisms in Iberia and South America, on some parts of the left, and in the case of Catholic social teaching, as with Quadragesimo Anno, kept alive in both theory and practice the more corporatist vision that sought to infuse the economic itself with the ethical and the political. And despite the oppressive and vertical fascist variants of this tendency that abolished representation of place altogether, a mistake, the social democratic settlements themselves significantly included a more horizontal mode of corporatist collaboration between government, business, trade unions, and religions and religious and cultural organizations at a level of governance beneath the formally representative one, as Michael Lind has so centrally emphasized and Wolfgang Streeck has also affirmed. Why then, since the 1970s, has liberalism returned with a vengeance and become ever more virulent? And why, in this more self-consistent form, is it bound to break down, as we now see in the fourth decade of the 21st century? In answer to the second question, what one can suggest here in a schematic but I think crucial way is that liberalism inherently involves a series of separations between different social aspects that have to be kept artificially apart in terms of achieving a purely formal order, and yet which remain in tension with each other and cannot ultimately be kept apart at all. In each case, what one sees is an initial separation of powers supposed to guarantee order because of a balance between inherently conflicting forces, followed later by the illegitimate capture, in liberal terms, of one power by another, and eventually by a fusion of powers which collapses their separation after all. At this point, the always lurking oligarchy within liberalism is fully exposed to view, and a mass protest against this oligarchic captured order tends to eventuate. First, in terms of this model, there is the overriding tension between the absolutely sovereign state and the presumptively atomic individual. Does the contract between such individuals really precede the state, or must the state already be in place for the contract to be possible? In consequence of this aporia, liberalism is drawn at once towards an international order of pure economy beyond the nation state, besides a legality of unmediable rights without distributive justice, both things massively evident in our own days, and yet equally towards a tyrannic trumping of all rights through state surveillance, albeit at times in the claimed interest of sustaining the non-interference of one person with another. In both directions, the capture of one pole by its opposite tends to eventual fusion. Partially to resolve just that aporia, the Scots 18th century social theorists suggested the mediations of market economy and social sympathy, acting as twin solvents between the state and the individual. But does commercial society come first as something natural, or is it rather enabled by the armed state itself in terms of rapacious enclosures and the growth of a walling debt economy, whereby finance tends to uproot and subordinate local substantive production? In reality, given this debt economy, both capitalism and the liberal state are preconditions of each other. But just for that reason, the market power of corporations can tend to capture the state, and conversely, the power of the mercantilist state can capture the market process. Thus, today we have the contrast of the market state in the USA and the state market in China. But insofar as they increasingly appear similar, we are witnessing a process of capture tending towards complete oligarchic and so-called neo-feudal fusion. Can the answer to this undesirable process be simply a renewal of social democracy, of which Christian democracy was simply a variant? It would seem not. In our own day, the social democratic model is breaking down because capitalism no longer delivers enough growth to sustain it. And in many countries, people impossibly demand both more state expenditure and lower taxes. This crisis faces both Britain and France right at this moment. Meanwhile, the intensified financialization of capitalism outruns attempts at the political limiting of inequality, even in a country like Sweden. Now, the reason capitalism no longer delivers sufficient growth is because it turns out that it's primarily driven by finance and rents and shareholder value rather than production or even profit. Capitalism is a negative, destructive process of dissolution. It's not a creative process at its core. It would ultimately rather lapse to this neo-feudal essence than return to the 20th century cycles of respectively favouring Keynesian demand or Hayekian supply in inevitable and contradictory oscillation, as Marxists have rightly said. The answer to the first question as to why post-war post-liberalism came to an end is that initially capitalist forces came to reject a focus on demand that threatened both their profits and their hegemony, but that eventually they retreated to a purer finance capitalism in hoped-for perpetuity rather than allow a new era of Keynesianism, Keynesian social democracy. That's why we've got runaway social and economic inequality in our times. It follows then, I think, that the only real post-liberal recourse in political economy would now be to try to reimagine a benign corporatism. If I understand him, this is exactly what Michael Lind is saying. Only a good corporatism can drive out the bad contemporary version, would be the claim, because it is this very duality of the economic and the political that renders a liberal order problematic and no longer resolvable by social democracy. Therefore, we need to demand by law, as Will Hutton has said, he is really a post-liberal perhaps, social purposes from firms alongside profit and governance sharing for workers, with consensually and legally adjudicated fair prices for consumers. And this was shown, I want to controversially say, in Portugal and Brazil during their corporatist eras for all their bad features. The trade-off for financiers and business people must be at once a new pride in the honor of pursuing a real and not often spurious social function, and the granting of real modes of political influence and representation for trades and vocations, however that is to be achieved. This is realistic because beyond success, people pursue social recognition. If it's disgraceful to become like Elon Musk, nobody will try to become like Elon Musk. There is also the question of whether this can be achieved just nationally or must be achieved also internationally. Here again, we face a liberal aporia as to whether the rights of nations come first, as for Grotius, or the rights of individuals within states, as for Hobbes. And here also, we can see a yen to capture in both directions. Neoliberalism tends to abolish state democracy in favor of an international market order. Yet rogue island states and now whole protectionist nations try, in reaction through fiscal dumping and so on, inversely to suck global finance and trade within their centripetal orbit, often in order to escape even international regulations as being too irksome. To a considerable degree, as rightly emphasized by Wolfgang Streeck, the answer here lies with the revival of the relatively self-sufficient nation-state, within which it's more possible to coordinate the economic with the political and the social. And as he says, we can have several productively diverse experiments going on. But as I think he also allows, the invocation of subsidiarity for the nation-state must apply also within states, implying a more distributed and plural exercise of sovereignty, the great British tradition of political pluralism of Harold Lasky that Michael Lind invokes. The same primacy of the associative and communitarian, which that principle involves, demands also some federal sharing of sovereignty beyond the state level, something that is in any case necessary in order realistically to combat the exponential reach and growth of the economic corporation. If the latter is to be politicized in order to be constrained, then that has to apply also, I think, at the international level, linked to a reworking of the kind of third way mutual protectionism envisaged by Keynes in the Bretton Woods arrangements. Other crucial liberal dualities follow the same patterns of tension and implosion. It seems that ever since Hobbes, humans are entirely animal, and yet that their cultural work is entirely artificial and machine-like, like Leviathan itself. Thus, we're always in danger of lapsing into what Agamben calls the bare life of animality and being abused by the state as such. And yet we are increasingly only respected if our behavior becomes more and more robotic and predictable, as we more and more forget that even artificial intelligence is initially constituted by our own human desires and intentions. So the animal captures the robot, or the robot captures the animal, as we increasingly enter the transhuman world of nanotechnology and implants in our brains. Similarly, our culture is caught between a left liberal demand that we prioritize nature over the human, and a right liberal demand that we prioritize a future artificial Superman over the human. Between the animal and the robot, the embodied human creature who somehow naturally wills and judges the objectively true, good, and beautiful is lost sight of. Liberalism is then, for these reasons, precisely not a politics of the soul, ever since Hobbes deliberately refuses that. And yet, if we are not really free spirits with souls, capable of objective but unpredictable judgment, how can there be any politics? How can there be any democracy at all, as opposed to the organization of systems? The religious and metaphysical issue of the reality of the soul is now, I submit, a political issue. In terms of politics, liberalism requires a balance of sovereign, executive, and judicial powers, rather than their organic collaboration, as in the real tradition of the English Constitution, in terms of the dynamic intuition and instantiation of natural justice. But where sovereign legitimacy under liberalism is divorced from administration, seen as a purely technical process, the latter tends to capture the former. Equally, where law and legislation are seen as rival powers, as in the United States, we get, rather than a continuous reciprocal legal hermeneutic, either a judiciary of rights displacing politics, as we see in the United States, or the courts themselves get increasingly nakedly politicized, as is happening in this country. In terms of our social life, ethics is seen as a purely private matter and law alone as a public one. But the upshot is either that everything legal is dangerously regarded as morally okay, or else law itself gets hopelessly moralized and thoughts themselves are criminalized and decent evangelical Christians are arrested and put in cells while burglars go free. Throughout the liberal mentality, as we saw with Smith's contrast of expediency and justice, there is a duality of the real and the ideal. Sometimes, as with neoliberal interventionism abroad, a false ideality swamps the reality principle altogether, as with Iraq. And yet, it remains not wrong, especially in the light of the recent fall of Assad in Syria, to say, as Tony Blair first pointed out, that ideological developments elsewhere may affect us in terms of refugees and terrorism. Pure isolationism is not possible. Both mere isolationism and ideologically neutral realpolitik, eschewing all modes of foreign intervention, is actually, I submit, not genuinely realistic. Equally, for all the convergence that do persist, ideological divides between the West on the one hand, Russia, China, and many Islamic regimes on the other. the total capture of the ideal by the real is no more plausible than the reverse and remains equally liberal. Just as Trump's proposed deregulated USA behind tariff walls is not really post-liberal at all. For a genuine post-liberalism, by contrast, as for the axial wisdom civilizations from which we derive, the ideal arises from natural reality itself. And on the other hand, an ideal that can't really be somewhat realized is only a fake and illusory ideal, an adolescent fantasy. Similarly, the economic is in organic continuity with the political, the national with the international, nature with culture, government with the courts, and ethics with law, just because none of these things make any sense if we are not pursuing some notion of the common good and some notion of objective human flourishing, which always involves social participation, artistic creativity, and metaphysical or religious contemplation. If we cannot and should not eschew the modern Faustian unleashing of freedom, technology, and creativity, partly based on negative liberty that has its place, then we need to re-embed this élan within the older, vertical, eternity-seeking Western Faustianism of positive liberty, as identified by Oswald Spengler, and exemplified surely by Notre Dame in Paris and other Gothic cathedrals. Otherwise, any distinctiveness of the West as tending uniquely to unite monistic harmony with respect for the individual person and the nourishing of freely associated corporations, especially, I think, in England, that will be lost as the merely imminently Faustian and modern liberal West permeates everywhere. By contrast, the reason we now have Trump, for all the lesser degree and the significant differences, the reason we now have Trump is the same reason that we once had Hitler. As Simone Weil divulged in exile from occupied France in London concerning the Hitlerian occupation of our own country, what she said is that all of our education, all of our science, and most of our culture suggests that meaningless force constitutes reality, and that liberty and value are either incidental froth or pure illusion. The men of power and spectacle who broadly hint with a knowing wink that all is indeed power and spectacle are then embraced as the authentic non-hypocrites, more likely to be able to cope with a reality that they unfazedly comprehend without a lot of pretentious crap. But to reiterate, the capture of ideality by supposed realism and the merger of the two is no more a true exiting from the liberal order than the capturing of reality by the illusion of a pure negative freedom everywhere prevailing. Instead, a genuine post-liberalism, embracing the unity of social bodies prior to the state and a more democratized tripartite order of wards, guilds, and congregations, as Michael Lind beautifully puts it, an order more focused on the working third estate, yet nonetheless guided by the truly wise, rooted in tradition rather than phony experts at every social level. This can only emerge when we return to the spiritual sources of our Western civilization, which are not simply antithetical to, though significantly different from the sources of the other post-axial domains. So the solution to the first general crisis, the liberal solution, has, I submit, run its course. And the attempt to substitute formalities and formal barriers for the real political interpersonal work of psychic shaping, that's failed. Therefore, once more, whether on the right or on the left, if those categories even remain apposite, we have to return to the revisionary work that sought for an alternatively modern version of the perennial politics of virtue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That was wonderful. We don't have exactly representatives of the labouring, priestly and warrior classes to respond, but we almost do. In Susannah Black-Roberts, who's senior editor at Plough, Mere Orthodoxy and New Polity, John Ritzema, who is a Pharos Fellow and Theology Don at Oxford, and Imogen Sinclair, Director of the Social Covenant Unit. I'll turn first to Susannah, then to John, and then to Imogen for the responses and thoughts. Susannah.
I think I'm meant to be the labouring classes, but which I have to say is an unusual sort of situation. Thank you so much for those remarks, John, and thank you all for coming to this thing that we've done, rather surprisingly. I want to respond both to John's remarks and also to give some background to the conference itself and to the manifesto that I think you ought to all have your hands on at this point. There we go, which it is our purpose to present to you, particularly in this keynote. So several years ago, after quite a few years of calling myself a post-liberal, in large part as the result of John's influence, something strange started happening in America, as it sometimes does, which is that a lot of other people started calling themselves post-liberals too. Now, on the one hand, this was extremely welcome. On the other, some of the emphases of this new crop of post-liberals has ranged from the mildly objectionable to the richly bizarre. The Christian nationalist movement seemed, at least sometimes, to locate the soul of the community in the nation and only in the nation. Race began to feature in rather strange ways. There was an enthusiasm for authoritarianism, including calls for a Protestant Franco. The group of us gathered around John, who now call ourselves the Center for Social Renewal, began talking about all of these things, primarily for some reason in this one very nice Polish restaurant in London, and at John and Alison's house. And one thing led to another, and we started a nonprofit. And then we wrote a manifesto, which sometimes happens. And now here we are. I think until yesterday we'd been suspecting that perhaps we were all hallucinating this, but we are not, and you're all here. The difficulty that we had, that we were noticing in the way that the term and a lot of these ideas were being used, is that, of course, post-liberalism as a term is necessarily ambiguous. All it means is not liberalism and after. It turns out that that can encompass quite a lot. Many people who call themselves post-liberal shared a similar critique to ours of liberalism, though there are differences. But the prescription is radically varied from let's gun the engine of populism in the American polity until it implodes, and then we can be warlords in a new Christian Mad Max-style wasteland, to let's find a sense of family and community among our so-called racial kin, to the exclusion of other sorts of family and community, to let's experiment with Holocaust denial, the way that some Silicon Valley tech bros are experimenting with microdosing LSD. Some of these suggestions have been, I'm in England, so I will use understatement, shall we say surprising. When we started meeting, I think all of us wanted to articulate a positive post-liberalism, which rather forcefully does not adopt either the warlordist, the hyper-nationalist, or the anti-Semitic or racialist vision, and which also does not throw out the goods associated with liberalism, things like habeas corpus, trial by jury, freedom of conscience, with the bathwater of radical individualism and a purely procedural vision of politics. So post-liberalism, as we mean it, posits that power, all of our various powers, which are also called virtues, ought to be aimed at the good, and that political power ought to be aimed at the political common good. It posits that humans are born into community and into helplessness, and that these are good things. It is a politics that is very aware of both birth and death, and that regards human people as profoundly valuable, both as infants and in their hidden lives before birth, and in their return to dependence as they approach the great passage of death. Our liberal society simply does not know what to do with people who are being born or who are dying. It can only really handle people who are safely far away from both of those milestones. As we grow from the helplessness of infancy into our adult powers, we have an obligation, one of our most profound duties, to recognize and love those of our kind who are undergoing both of these mysteries, one of which we have all done, and the other of which, despite the transhumanists and Brian Johnson, we will all do. In addition to a politics that protects and honors people at every time of their life, we need urgently a politics that pushes back against what might be called the values of the post-Christian right, and the secular, technocratic, and transhumanist world, which are very often strangely friendly to each other. We need to do this by practicing and promoting a new Christian humanism. What is at stake here? What is an example of this high-tech post-Christian right vision? John pointed towards it towards the end of his talk. I'm a shameless pronatalist, but without the grounding of good anthropology, even this can go wrong. The point of pronatalism is not to manufacture the maximum number of the best possible babies. The people who are probably the most famous pronatalists in my country are a couple called Simone and Malcolm Collins, who believe that conceiving children by having sex is morally wrong. One ought to conceive children. I'm not kidding. I'm not making this stuff up. One ought to conceive children by creating a very large number of embryos and then doing polygenic risk score selection and implanting the very best and ditching the rest. Their children are lovely toddlers made in God's image, but this is not a humane vision of what it means to have a child. We desperately need a new humanism for other reasons as well, which, again, John gestured towards. The first, or at least most famous, round of Christian humanism was born in the Renaissance. Today's AI revolution can most accurately be understood as an anti-Renaissance, where the particular powers and abilities, what Lord Skidelsky has called the excellences of humans, rational thought and discussion, writing and reading, making art, and the care for each other, are denigrated and rubbished by the false logos and false creativity of ChatGPT and Midjourney, the false care of AI friends, even, as you might have seen, AI priests. At the center of post-liberal politics, as we mean it, must be a commitment to staying human. I think that as an aspect of our project, we need something like a movement called the Stay Human movement, along the lines of the arts and crafts movement or the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which will not sort of push against the accusation of nostalgia, which I will get to later. We should insist on making our own art, writing our own essays, conceiving our own children. Finally, we need a politics that is founded not on a flattened-out nationalism that's fundamentally a child of liberalism, but on civic friendship and the good, what Cicero identified as the origin of Rome's strength, and what Althusius described more precisely as the exchange of symbiotic right, a politics based fundamentally on friendship rather than enmity. Will Hutton yesterday accused us of a nostalgia. I deny that this is so. But if I had nostalgia, my nostalgia would be for writing an essay or drawing a picture beginning with a blank page, for conceiving children by having sex rather than by selecting and implanting the very best embryos, for dying without suicide, and for a politics based on friendship rather than enmity. These are the human things which I insist, and I think that we in this Society for Civic Renewal insist, are not destined to die in a dusty nostalgia, but which will never finally leave us as long as we are the kinds of creatures that we are. When we begin to forget the kinds of creatures that we are, the task is simple but urgent. We must remember.
Thank you so much, Susannah. Thank you. And now, John.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you, John and Imogen, for those very stimulating remarks. So, for reasons initially unrelated to this conference, I was recently reading a newish history of the Jacobites. And in an unusually lively review of the historiography of Jacobitism, the author lighted upon some particularly venomous remarks made by David Cannadine in the mid-1980s. He diagnosed, quote, the new Jacobite view of history as a willfully perverse celebration of such obscurantist troglodytes as the Young Pretender, the Tractarians, and the Duke of Windsor, which makes even the embittered splutterings of Hilaire Belloc seem models of fair-mindedness and tolerance by comparison. Now, you're probably wondering what I think any of that has to do with this August conference. As a point of fact, some of my best friends are obscurantist troglodytes. And I'm not sure that any of the victims of Cannadine's drive-by invective deserves to be in the same company as the correctly unlamented Edward VIII. But John, in his own keynote, has just noted a few times that in the early 19th century, there were several sort of post-liberal moments, some partially successful attempts to unwreak the havoc of the French Revolution, that revolution which, as they would see it, to borrow a phrase, all that was solid had melted into air and all that was holy had been profaned. And since this panel now is clearly constructed around theological and religious impulses which motivate much contemporary post-liberal thought, I thought I would use those apparently troglodytic Tractarians as a launching point. And I should stress that they are a launching point. I don't aim to convert you all to sort of head-banging Anglo-Catholicism. They're a launching point for thinking theologically about the cultivation of what John is calling a post-liberal politics of virtue. So, as I'm sure you all know, the Tractarians were an Oxford-based group, most famously John Henry Newman, Edward Bouverie Pusey, and John Keble, who led a struggle known to history as the Oxford Movement, which sought to repair and recover elements of the Catholic tradition which they thought had been obscured, neglected, or marginalised in the post-Reformation Church of England. Now, what's this got to do with post-liberalism or the politics of virtue? 3 very brief answers to that question. First, as Professor Clarke explained yesterday afternoon, that language of liberalism really bubbles up in the 1820s, identifying critiques of older worldviews which centred on church and king. And things come to a head politically after the Great Reform Act, particularly with the passage of the Church Temporalities Act 1833, by which the Reformed Parliament reorganised the established church in Ireland. And the Tractarians saw this as a kind of Whig and liberal assault on the pre-reform relationship between church and state, and it prompted Keble's famous assize sermon on national apostasy. Would that we had sermons with such titles today. John. Tractarianism was thus directly concerned with the desacralisation of politics and with criticisms of moral and legal overreach by an overconfidently sovereign parliament. It was a conscious attempt to re-articulate certain higher things, namely the Catholic tradition, including both revealed and natural law, within the church and to the state. Second, similar to a lot of contemporary post-liberalism, it was the project of disaffected academics. Some of my best friends, etc., who successfully established and cannily exploited bridgeheads, particularly the Fellowship at Oriel and Pusey's Regius Professorship at Christ Church. And third, all of this spilled out into the wider world. From Oxford common rooms and canonries, a programme of restoration was exported to the wider ecclesiastical world, but which generated concomitant missionary, educational and social efforts in the wider world, such as those in the industrial slums of Victorian England, for which the 19th century Anglo-Catholics are still quite fondly remembered. Maybe not by David Cannadine. So, what are my particular responses then to John's keynote, beginning from the Tractarians? In the interest of time, I'll give 1 long and 2 short suggestions. So first, I think one great challenge for post-liberals at the moment is to think about the process of changing the public imaginary. Now, I don't mean deluding ourselves and others that certain things are true because they ought to be, but rather adopting and propagating a way of seeing the world which is expansive and which breaks out of the current flat official consensus view of the polity, of its purpose, and of the sources of its life and legitimacy. In other words, seeing things more freely and creatively without our sight being unmoored from the material and the practical. For the Tractarians, this was the recovery and expansion of what we'd now call a sacramental worldview. That included re-articulating a high view of the sacraments themselves, namely the real presence of Christ in the Eucharistic species, and the supernatural efficacy of baptism as a mystical washing away of sin and recreation of the human creature, etc., etc. But it also involved a refreshed way of seeing the natural world and engaging with Christian culture. It was a renaissance of typology, of allegory, a rediscovery of old ways of reading, which, for example, helped former evangelicals like Newman read the familiar books of Scripture in a way that was to them radically fresh and creative and expansive. I think something like this, the analogy I'm drawing, is a necessary response to the utilitarianism, technocracy, cynicism, and cultural disaffection of large swathes of our political class. They and we need to relearn how to see some hidden and some higher things. And so we might think about how to bolster the poetic in our politics and our philosophy. I've got in mind C.S. Lewis's caustic critique of the unpoetic tendency in the political imagination, when he wrote, "Monarchy can be easily debunked, but watch the faces, mark well the accents of the debunkers. These are the men whose taproot in Eden has been cut, whom no rumour of the polyphony, the dance, can reach." I think this is the kind of soulless rule by lanyard which characterises far too much of British official culture, it's in the political world, it's in the universities. And its cure is the recovery of the sacramental lens, of typology, the recovery and articulation of real presences. In the political realm, it would involve a fresh awareness that the institutions which constitute our state and society don't merely mediate between present-day humans, but between our society and its forebears, its future, and realities beyond the bluntly material or conventional social constructs. Now, this is partly, as was the Oxford movement, a cultural and educational project. Keble, of course, was the professor of poetry at Oxford, and the Christian Year, his cycle of poems on the calendar, did as much to advance the movement as the tracts ever did, certainly in terms of readership. And so, thinking about what John said a few moments ago about soul-shaping in the polity and the idea of an education into virtue and this call for a kind of a new humanism, I think it's worth noting the way in which the Tractarians did that and to kind of search around for the green shoots in the academy that we can spring on. So in my world, I think in particular in contemporary Oxford of Hindi Neumann, who is the professor of Old Testament Oriel these days, who wrote an arresting article in 2017 on teaching the Bible within the wider humanities, a project that she has described as ethical reading. And she talks about how a particular kind of literary study can shape the ethical subject. This is an echo of the Italian Renaissance's recovery of the classical idea that literary, historical, and philosophical study furnished the free citizens with the tools and the ethos necessary to participate in a healthy public life. The example that she works from is Rilke's poem, the Archaische Torso Apollos, which describes the experience of seeing this damaged statue of a divine body, and you kind of have to fill in the blanks as you're reading it, and this presents an aesthetic and then, in some sort of kind of romantic sense, a more personal challenge. It ends with the challenge, you must change your life. I think it's vital for a post-liberal cultural movement to offer the kind of literary, artistic, liturgical and rhetorical challenges which reorient the citizen or the student or the colleague, and so on. That was a long thought. I'll give you two 30-second short thoughts to wrap up. The first is that the Tractarians were engaged in a conscious project of ressourcement, of renewal through engaging with the tradition, as well as returning ad fontes, to the originary sources themselves, for them, obviously, scripture and so on. And Jonathan Clarke challenged us yesterday to see the task as building from the ground up. That's certainly true in a sense. Morris Glasman also said that we need to build new things out of old things. And thinking about how movements like Tractarianism did that and their successes and failures is an interesting way to look into that. The second short thought is, I mentioned the Assize sermon earlier. The Tractarians were really concerned about the theological limits placed on political and legal sovereignty. And given concerns articulated by John and by Susannah about, shall we say, potentially more sinister forms of post-liberalism, this is something that we might think about it. Famously, in English law, there was a case at the beginning of the 17th century, Dr. Bonham's case, in which Edward Coke opined that when an act of Parliament was against common right and reason or repugnant or impossible to be performed, the common law would control it and adjudge it to be void. Now, that was a dead end in terms of how the courts interacted with bad law. But it doesn't disappear from the intellectual world of the English kind of politico-theological tradition, of which the great exponent is probably William Blackstone. And if you look at the commentaries on the law of England, there is this extensive discussion about how the common law is grounded ultimately in divine and natural law. And I think re-articulating that is a major challenge for post-liberals in this country. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I think we should invite you to preach a sermon on the apostasy of the nation when the House of Commons next convenes for the King's speech. So we've had, by happy serendipity, words from the labouring and words from the priestly elements of post-liberalism. Now on to a warrior for post-liberalism. Imogen Sinclair. Imogen.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, John. Thank you, John. And thank you, Susannah. I'm also married to the priestly class, so I don't know what that means anything. I also feel very un-post-liberal speaking from a screen. I hope you'll forgive me, I couldn't find a printer. My remarks, I'm afraid, resemble something of an analysis of the manifesto that's being distributed at this conference that we are encouraged to read and to celebrate. And it's somewhat a close exegesis of the text, if you will. And I can't promise you that at times it won't feel like a Bible study. Susannah, John and I were discussing last night that this panel is very much the God panel. So buckle up. There is, I suppose, a very general theme to my remarks around the idea that liberalism, which I'm kind of presuming we all sort of dislike to some extent, has failed. Liberalism has failed because it goes against the grain of some natural, social, perhaps sacred order, and that its decline is therefore inevitable. John Milbank remarked that Edmund Burke basically suggested that the French Revolution was, for this reason, attempting a kind of impossible anti-politics. The manifesto that I hope you all read and I can commend to you makes an example of the inhumane implications of liberalism, which is too often led by economic factors. For instance, the manifesto laments that policing is reduced to a calculation of utility and rights rather than a negotiation of human interests, or that education exists to produce humans as commodities for the labour market, or the ever-prevalent flirtation with transhumanism. And I love that phrase in the manifesto about how liberalism wants us to be robotic and predictable. That's kind of how we're supposed to behave as humans, but we don't. We might also suggest that this inhumaneness is also unnatural or ill-fitting somehow of an inherent or preordained purpose for humans as social animals, and on this basis bound to fail. I am in sympathy with the remarks of the late Jewish sociologist Philip Rieff, who I think is massively underread. He said this, quote, "A full transition to a post-communal culture," read liberal for argument's sake, "a full transition to a post-communal culture may never be achieved because there are safeguards built into both human nature and culture limiting the freedom of men to atomize themselves." Rieff also said that no culture has ever survived where there was not a registration of sacred order. He can be a bit exuberant at times. So here we are presented with the idea that the failings of liberalism are not just procedural and not even just ethical, but somehow metaphysically inerrant or deficient. Perhaps the unforgivable sin of liberalism is more than a separation of the economic and the political or the social, but it's an inhumane, unnatural, and ruinous separation of nature and supernature. The manifesto implores us not to lose the dignity that makes us human. And I thought that's quite a curious phrase, the dignity that makes us human, because it presumes that something bigger than the human, something pre-natural, something supernatural perhaps, gives humans value, worth, dignity, like whoever or whatever created us. It is the honour of every human being to be created a little lower than the angels, and therefore with inviolable dignity. I told you it might come across like a Bible study at times. This metaphysical basis for human dignity shouldn't really be acceptable to secular ears, those that only accept a material basis for truth. But I think it is, actually, to many, isn't it, acceptable? I love this weird line from Tom Holland, who says this: "To believe in the existence of human rights requires no less of a leap of faith than it does to believe in, say, angels or the Trinity. The origins of the concept lie not in the application of the methods of science, so prized by the Amsterdam Declaration, but in medieval theology." It's a weird statement because angels and human rights sort of category error, but I think it's interesting and curious. A pause and a caveat here. I've tried to draw out the metaphysical basis for post-liberalism, which I think is more or less implied by the concern for a human natural order, and we read about that in the manifesto. Do we need to get specific? Like, which metaphysical basis? Not particularly, no, but the manifesto does call us to renew the West from within. And I take this to mean that we must renew our particular civilizational order, our particular sacred order, and I think this is the Christian order. Paradoxically, there is nothing more universal than this. How can something that is culturally contingent, if you like, Christianity, a distinctly Western civilization, also be universally true? Ask John. But I'm going to attempt something here. I know you'll forgive me for this next twist because it's Advent, and we are at Corpus Christi College, so for goodness sake, if I can't talk about the incarnation of Christ now, when can I? It's a strange thing, but the incarnation of Christ represents the full integration of the supernatural in nature, God in human, fleshy form at a specific time and place in a cultural moment. At the first Christmas, a universal particular order was revealed. And I think this is a very Milbankian thing to say, but our civilizational story gives us a certain logic that can or does accept this paradox. Our culture believes in human dignity because it's a reasonable or logical conclusion of a deeply theological narrative. This is the gift or the givenness of Christianity, a logic or a narrative of politics or a virtue. Sadly, as Jens Zimmermann, I think that's how you pronounce his name, has observed, secularization has outrun the momentum given to it by Christianity. And an example of this is the perversion of the concept of dignity in the debate around assisted suicide. Secular reasoning dictates that dignity is a status only held by those with a particularly prized quality, property, capacity, or attribute, like rationality or autonomy or self-consciousness. This is fatal, and literally a fatal error made by many of those that support assisted suicide. Life is only worth living if you are well, or if you want it. James Mumford, who is a friend to many of us here, concludes that modern secular philosophy typically takes the human out of human dignity. When dignity is unmoored from its religious foundations, Mumford says, it metastasizes into something unrecognizable. I'm afraid if, as a society, we do not welcome Christian humanism, we do not welcome humanism at all. The manifesto calls for a political order founded on love, in the spirit of Augustine. So, the Christian order is founded on love, the love of God who gave himself in human form. Here endeth the first lesson. The second is brief, I promise. Here is my very smooth segue into talking about sex. I've done it, that's a segue. And this is the last weird twist my presentation will make, I promise. But the manifesto argues that a post-liberal renewal starts with already formed communities, the first of which is, of course, the family. And actually, if I had one criticism of the manifesto, which I have already mentioned to Susannah, it would be that it, I think, lacks an explicit pronatalism. So this is my unsolicited postscript to the manifesto. To make a family, you need children, and to make children, you need sex. Sex is at the beginning of everything. And I feel at liberty to indulge in some personal anecdote, not that personal. But since... Yes, since falling pregnant, I'm going to manipulate you all with my pregnancy.
It was because of sex.
It was, yes, it was the fun way, Since falling pregnant, I have felt keenly, actually, the enormous responsibility and privilege of it all. In the womb, the most hidden, mysterious place, hope is stored for future civilization, where tiny humans, are nurtured by families into the responsible citizens we need for a politics of virtue. We don't all need to have children, of course, but making babies is the most pro-social, pro-human thing you can do. And you can thank me later. So friends, what I'm saying here, I think, is make it metaphysical, make it Christian, and make babies.
Thank you, Imogen, for those three injunctions, two of which we can take as our actions for today, and the third of which we can reflect on for later.
Day and night covered there.
Yes, yes. I'd welcome thoughts, questions, and so on. And the one favour I would ask is that, of course, we're friends here, but if people, even if I know who you are, if you introduce yourself briefly before making your point, then that would help. So, yes, just there.
That was an absolutely wonderful panel from all of you. I feel so inspired. And Imogen, your question, your contribution especially, I think, is quite relevant to what I had intended to ask anyway, which is, I think it's fair to say, to echo your point just now, that we believe that there are universal truths and values to which we are all, by virtue of being human, aspiring, or to which we should aspire. And so we have this, on the one hand, quite a radical universalism at the level of the ideal and at the level of the intellectual. But at the same time, as you emphasise, we also believe in the particular and the necessity of being rooted to a particular culture and a community. Now, I think we don't see a contradiction between those two things, and I think epistemologically, metaphysically, you can absolutely defend the claim that while we may have shared universal truths and values, we need particular means of reaching those because we are embodied, and that is how we come to know ideas. It's through those embodied relationships and through that cultural particularity. But I think most people think they're in contradiction. I think it's really hard to convey that, which is why often there's a perceived chasm between a kind of liberal cosmopolitan universalism and an extremely particularistic kind of racial nationalism, which says, well, we're so intent on keeping our own cultural particularities that we're going to exclude all others and treat one as superior. And I think, just to emphasize, I think we know that it doesn't have to be that way. That is a false dichotomy. But how do you go about overcoming what does really seem like a contradiction to so many people? How do you reconcile the universal and the particular as you prompt, Imogen?
Lovely. And in the front row.
Philip Blond. Yeah, building on Esme's reflection. John, I was listening to your speech and I thought, well, what could make this true? What could realise this in the world? Because I fundamentally agree with you. We have had societies governed by honour and not by money in the past. And I don't agree with Polanyi on his historiography, but his point about the market has disembedded itself from value and dominates value seems correct. And so the question is begged is, we are in a contest of universals. And if liberalism has one universal, it is that there is no universals. Mm-hmm. And if we're in a contest of universals, we can't elide from that point. We have to the only thing that could make what you outlined true is everybody agreeing on the universals, both in our country and in the world at large. And that seems inseparable historically and really from a certain sort of imperialism of the universal, that we need one variant of that universal to win out. Now, obviously for us, and here I take the earlier point, that would be Christianity, because Christianity allows the maximal degree, I think, of differentiation within it that is compatible with human freedom. But if I recall Pierre Manet's point, The origin of liberalism in part lies because people felt they couldn't agree about universals, and that's the purchase and the success of liberalism. And they promised peace without the war of the universals. So how are we going to, in one sense, insist rightly on the war of the universals and prevent a liberal conclusion from that?
Thank you. And gentleman just there.
Thanks for a great panel. I'm Gabriel Brom. I wonder, how are we post-liberals supposed to feel about material abundance? If the economist Deirdre McCloskey were here today, I'm sure she would say something about a hockey stick that describes the poverty of mankind up until the 19th century or something. And then, well, I'm asking. And moreover, the last time I spoke to her about this, she insisted to me that it was a Christian duty specifically to pursue growth for the sake of the poor of the world that remain. And she was very much pointing to those who have been brought out of poverty in the last 30 years or so, thanks to this hockey stick. But I'd like the post-liberal view, if you'd be kind enough.
So 3 very great questions. We'll come back and take some more in a couple of moments. But John.
Yes, well, really good questions about the universal. And gives me a chance to say something I probably meant to say, that I think what we've got at the moment is a sort of contrast, conflict between abstract... what we've got at the moment is conflict between abstract liberal universalism on the one hand and sort of ethnic particularism on the other hand. Now, I submit that that is precisely the upshot of secularization. In other words, it's the axial civilizations for whom the universal is the transcendent, that are able to mediate the particular and the universal within the immanent order, precisely because they have the sense that the universal is something mysterious we're groping towards, rather than something already known about and manipulated by experts. People are not so alienated from this universal. And indeed, as Esme is suggesting, the only way you get to this universal is by incarnated ritual practices. And so this probably helps answer your point. This is allied to the priority of civilizations, which indeed is not separable from the question of empire. Ultimately, it's the priority of civilizations over simply nations on the one hand, or mere kind of abstract Bill Gates kind of globalization on the other hand. So then obviously the question arises about the clash of civilizations and the clash of universals. And here I want to kind of mediate a bit, perhaps, between Michael Lind on the one hand and Imogen on the other hand. Sort of Michael was saying the other day, well, we've got to agree and sort of bracket the fact that we metaphysically disagree. And Imogen was saying, and maybe Philip was saying, well, actually, you know what? Christianity is the real universal, and it's got to win out. I don't go exactly for either of those positions, and there's a sort of slight lurking traditionalism and perennialism in my paper that Esme will work. Oh, by the way, you've all kind of totally outed us. We were trying to achieve, political secular respectability with this conference. But oh no, it's all now being exposed, all this metaphysical stuff. So what I'm trying to say here is that when we're dealing with Christians and Muslims and Jews and Buddhists and Hindus, especially because there's already been an incredible history of interaction, including, for example, massive Christian influence on modern Hinduism. The idea that we completely metaphysically disagree is, I submit, false. On the contrary, I think there's often far more ground between me and a reflective, mystical Muslim than between me and a total secular rationalist. After all, we're coming to some degree from the same books and with the same traditions, and there are hidden along the Silk Roads. There are all sorts of hidden connections. So I'm not a total perennialist. I do think that there's some ultimacy about Christianity, but I don't, I do think we can concretely live. Even if, the fact that we think the sacred fully appears in a human being, not a law book, not a set of codes, that is significant for why we believe in human dignity. Nonetheless, the idea that we have to simply triumph over other civilizations, rather debate with them, live with them, mutually enrich, I would reject that. But what I would say is that, there's been a lot of clashes in the past, but we need, we need the more sophisticated and reflective versions of religions. They're actually often linked with more embedded rituals. As, the Jesuits in Latin America, the Jesuits in the Far East were able to achieve a certain eclecticism in this kind of way. So that would be my answer about the universals. Just very, very quickly, I wanted to really welcome what John is saying about the symbolic, because it's the symbolic, and it's not just the Oxford movement, but Romanticism in general. The symbolic tears apart the real and the ideal, and it's artificial. And liberalism wants to separate very abstract meaning from, very concrete utility. And that applies in the economy as well. We need literally a symbolic economy. A sense of the symbolic at the core of the economy, and this is linked to gift exchange, according to Marcel Mauss. So, just those 2 points.
I'll be very, very brief because John said it all, I think. But your question, Esme, I mean, it's. I kind of want to say it's impossible. I don't really believe that, but the sort of idea that you can kind of get behind your culture, you can kind of strip away all the cultural baggage and realise some true, eternal, purely natural, procedural idea, which is not Christianity. I think is based. I think John E. Lacoste calls it a logic of satiety. It's impossible to kind of get behind your culture. We are cultured beings, and that's that. And I'm sorry if that sounds so kind of defeatist, but I think it's true. Otherwise, invite people to church. So I do.
John, is there anything you'd like to add? We'll have to close shortly, but there's a gentleman right at the back in the blue sweatshirt.
So thank you so much for the brilliant paper. So my question is to His Holiness, Milbank. Just to push the devil's advocates even further, so if I dare to abbreviate the title, The Politics of Virtue, it sounds like theodicy, or just to reference the final chapters of your book, Social Science and Theology, when you read brilliantly Augustine's division of the two cities, and then, as you rightly argue, he absolutely condemns the cities of the territory, city of the world, and advocate the city of God. But the question with that and the problem with that can be, as you end the chapter with some concession to Foucault in saying that if we don't take Foucault's criticism seriously, our church or the church-like structure can be another order such as pure power interest and corruption. And given the context we're operating, we have the HRification of the world. How do you prevent this politics of virtue becomes a veneer for theodicy, right?
And gentleman in the red sweater.
Yeah, thank you, Mateusz, Poland. A question to John about tension between virtue and popular opinion or democracy at the present moment. Because like us post-liberals, we tend to, say, okay, the people is rejecting false values, and this is very true in many cases. But as I'm being told, majority of the people in Britain now support the assisted dying thing. So the question here is, how then what's the criteria if it's not and how should post-liberals reflect on something more than just reflecting the popular opinion of the moment on things that we stand for?
It's a very good question. Without wanting to challenge the basic premise, which is very important, I should say that opinion research suggests that actually when people say they support assisted dying, what they actually often support is easing someone's path out of this life, not facilitating suicide. And that is why many of those, please forgive me abusing my position in the chair, many of those who argue for this legislation use the phrase assisted dying because they know that it's disingenuous.
Yes, yes, but we can name abortion, say, even in Poland.
Your broader point is valid. And finally, yes, the gentleman there. Please.
Thank you. My name's Adam. Really, this is a question, I guess, for the two Johns on the panel. Really, I was fascinated by what you were saying about creativity and artistic production. I would just sort of be grateful for perhaps a few more thoughts on the idea of creativity as a virtue and of its importance to human flourishing. And then perhaps what can be done to give opportunities to foster our innate creativity for people in society more generally, whether that can or not ideally be, as was being suggested, a more poetic creativity.
Thank you. And I'll go from Susannah across the panel, if there's anything you'd like to say in response, Susannah, and then John, then Imogen, and then John.
I think I will pass to my right.
John? So thinking about resourcement and returning to our traditions and trying to find in them models and stories that help us think philosophically about virtue. I suppose a starting place might be to think about, so I work on the Old Testament, thinking about the anthropology of the Old Testament, thinking about how the creation is presented in Genesis, and Adam, the man, being put in the garden to till it and to keep it. So to cooperate in the maintenance and flourishing of what it is that the deity has created as kind of, the big initial project. And as Imogen hinted, quoting Psalm 8, man in the Old Testament is often presented as kind of a little god. When it says we're created in the image of God, the texts sometimes mean that fairly literally, right? Like the God of the Old Testament is sometimes pretty anthropomorphic, and the sort of virtues that are celebrated in man are really reflections of like the good characteristics of the deity. And so I suppose a kind of Christian articulation of the virtue of creativity would point that there's a kind of imitatio Dei there, and that's something that is cultivated as part of the good life. Imogen?
Nothing to add.
And John?
Yeah, that reminds me, one thing I want to say is a very simple point. For all kinds of reasons, long preceding secularity, the Bible has been studied by clergy and kind of the classical culture by the laity. And I think one reform we need, and a lot of even secular people in France are now supporting this, is to say that we should all be looking at the Bible as well as at the classical legacy. That if these are the roots of our culture, then non-dogmatically the Bible should be included within the curriculum. And I think it would be a peaceful thing to do. I think it would encourage people to have different degrees of relationship to this Bible, to the Bible, including not necessarily saying I believe it all or I don't believe it all. And I think it would, so much can't be understood without reading the Bible. So that's one thing I wanted to say. On the point about democracy and the people, I think, to my mind, and we, Adrian and I have said this, it's very much part of post-liberalism that we don't believe in outright democracy. We agree with Karl Marx about that, or sort of outright equality. That's also rejected by Marx. But much more we believe in mixed governments, and that any order is somehow a blending of the one and the few and the many, as the classics taught. And representative democracy involves some level of wise advice. And if you don't have the wise, you have trashy influences. That's, there is no non-hierarchical society. Again, Marx says that. You only drive out the bad hierarchy with the better hierarchy. So while, yes, we need democracy and more political participation, we also have to look at the question of better leadership and more responsible and wiser leadership and guidance, you know, and that in that sense, society should always be educative. As for HR and the church, well, the church has got to stop, you know, operating in terms of HR. We've just discovered where that leads. And above all, you know, it's churches or other religious organizations that should be setting examples of more interpersonal, charismatic, symbolic kind of leadership that the secular institutions should then copy. You know, the influence should go the other way. McCloskey, Adrian and I, in our books, The Politics of Virtue, criticise what she says. There was a recent fabulous book called The Green Middle Ages that totally demolishes the idea that the Middle Ages were completely poor and boring because they didn't have you know, cinema or this kind of nonsense. It's an absolutely brilliant book by a German historian. I recommend it, and you know, it's clear that the more we get capitalist, in fact, the more we get poorer in genuine terms, and the more inequality increases and so on. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much to all of our panel.